2 weeks ago on this channel, I made a video about one of the bigger events in ECW's early history, the first Holiday Hell event in 1993. That got me thinking about the last one, which occurred in 2000, and was one of the last shows the company ever held. While December 93 was an optimistic time for the still young Eastern Championship Wrestling, December 2000 was a very dark time for those involved, from the wrestlers to those behind the scenes. In this video, we'll look at ECW Holiday Hell 2000. We'll look at the state of the company going into it, the card that was put on that night, and the wrestlers who were involved. We'll also look at what the newsletters were saying at the time. Over this past year, I've talked about a lot of ECW, from some of the high points to quite a lot of the lows, but never the very end. For my last video, I watched a lot of early ECW, and that gave me the idea to this time cover one of the last events, one that was held under very different circumstances. On December 23rd, 2000, ECW presented the final Holiday Hell event at the ECW Arena, the same place where the first was held back in '93. Things weren't looking good though, as ECW was several weeks behind in paying their roster. They were at risk of not having enough footage recorded to air on TV, having cancelled shows, and they were about to run their final event in the building they called home for many years. As time went on, shows were held at the ECW Arena less and less. At its peak, there would be up to 17 shows a year, such as in 95 and 6. Later on, there were just 9 events in 99, only 6 in 2000, and none would follow in 2001. This is because of 2 reasons. The promotion touring more, covering more states in 2000, even their first show in Canada, than in any other year previous. The other reason is that ECW needed bigger venues in hopes of generating more revenue to sustain itself. There were thoughts around the time that the Hammerstein Ballroom, which the company had only started hosting events at a few months earlier, could become ECW's new regular home, given that its capacity was around double the ECW Arena, and much bigger than their regular New York home, the Elks Lodge in Queens. Whether this would have worked, especially by December 2000, feels unlikely, but there must have been a feeling that the company needed to make some changes. It seems that other promotions were noticing this trend as well. On November 18th, 2000, months before the company would close its doors, Jersey All Pro Wrestling would present their first ever event outside New Jersey. Their 3rd anniversary show would be at the ECW Arena, also known as South Philly Invasion. As if to add insult to injury, the main event on this night was Sabu vs Axel Rotten, 2 former ECW wrestlers, one of which had left on very bad terms. Jersey All Pro would run more events there after ECW closed, including one on February 3rd, 2001 called The New Beginning, clearly a jab at ECW, also including the Sandman, one of their last world champions. As we get into December, morale was low as you might expect. There were things to be positive about though. For their last pay-per-view, November to Remember, the company had packed 4,500 fans into the Odeum Expo Center in Illinois, and they were set to add a new special event to the calendar. Massacre on 34th Street took place on December 3rd at the Hammerstein Ballroom, where the company had sold out twice that year already. 2,500 fans were packed in, making for a 3rd sellout. There was evidence supporting the idea that there was still some fan demand for ECW. Massacre on 34th Street is not considered the strongest of ECW pay-per-views, but there are some memorable things to take away from it. A brutal match for the television title took place between Rhino and Spike Dudley, who had been fighting for weeks on television, with Rhino getting the upper hand. This would end up no different, with Spike left laying in a puddle of his own vomit, as a result of Rhino choking him out. The show would also include one title change, a coronation of sorts for two genuine ECW originals. Two of the very few graduates of the House of Hardcore training school, Danny Doring and Roadkill. The unlikely tag team would win their first championships from the full-blooded Italians, Little Guido and Tony Mamaluke, and would hold them until the end of the promotion. In the main event, Steve Corino would defend the world title against two men who had also been first-time champions that year, Jerry Lynn and Just Incredible. After Corino retained the title, the Sandman would attack and would steal the world title belt. This is worth remembering when we get to Holiday Hell. Backstage at the show, Paul Heyman gave each wrestler their check, promising that things weren't going to change anytime soon. I assume he meant that positively, but you could also read that as Paul admitting to his roster that they were still going to be behind on payments. At the meeting, Heyman admitted that the company is going through a frustrating financial time, but added that it will not go out of business. He described the company's problems as short-term, but fixable, and vowed that he will not bankrupt the company. I give Paul quite a lot of leeway in these videos sometimes, but the idea that the company's financial problems were short-term is laughable. If you've seen my video on the start of ECW on TNN, I talked about financial problems dating back to mid-99, when Paul was trying to make deals that would hopefully save the company, like the one he landed for Acclaim to make ECW video games, and loan the company some money. On the subject of Paul making deals, it's also noted that Paul was still trying to get new national television following the collapse of the show on TNN. USA Network, FX, and Fox Sports Network are all named, but nothing was anywhere near set in stone. Following the cancellation of a tour in Texas, ECW's next event would take place 2 weeks later on December 15th from the Elks Lodge in Queens, New York, which was added to the schedule as a way to improve ECW's money problems. The company charged higher than usual ticket prices to try and raise funds to pay debts, and for this elevated ticket price, they presented a one-off appearance by Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley, as well as a surprise appearance from Taz. They were also hoping to use as much of the show as possible to produce more content for Hardcore TV. Unfortunately for ECW, the show sold out of seated tickets, but didn't overspill like most of the shows there did, so the result was ultimately disappointing, not raising as much money as they would have wanted. If the wrestlers weren't already unhappy, they were even more so coming out of this night. The wrestlers did not receive their scheduled paychecks at the Queens event, leaving most of them 7 weeks behind in pay. Heyman did not hold a meeting in Queens to address the matter, but some wrestlers claimed that he told them the checks would be sent to them during the week. To make things even worse, there were reports that the company cancelled a few checks they had issued to the wrestlers during the previous pay period, though Heyman had blamed the wrestlers for this, saying that the checks were post-dated and they were trying to cash them too early. The same edition of The Torch reported that rumours have spread that a few wrestlers have discussed the idea of boycotting the December 23rd show at the ECW arena. While no specific wrestlers are named, Wade Keller claims that some were threatening this, while others were laughing at the suggestion. As the final episode of Hardcore TV would air 1 week later, none of the December 23rd show would be used for television, although fan cam footage exists, so we are able to see the event. The footage from this event seems to have been intended for TV, because in 2013, RF Video released a much better quality version of the show, including commentary by Tommy Dreamer and Danny Doring. Dreamer actually notes at one point that he booked this show, and alludes to having some creative influence throughout. This version of the event includes unedited footage of Joey Styles and Joel Gertner filming an intro for Hardcore TV, one that would never make air. So now we get to the show itself, and for the sake of brevity, I'll divide it into the undercard and the main matches later on. In the opener of the night, the blue guy faced Chilly Willy. While the blue guy was very familiar to the fans in the ECW arena, he looked very different in this run with the company, having lost over 100 pounds near the end of his time with WWE. Chilly Willy, however, was a relative newcomer to ECW, having made his debut in February of 2000. In the RF video commentary, Tommy Dreamer says that to his mind, Chilly Willy would have become a mainstay in the company had ECW stayed open longer, also noting that he was later signed to a WWE developmental deal. He worked in OVW, but never made it past a couple of dark matches on main WWE shows. There's not a whole lot to say about this match, as I've already talked about both guys for longer than it actually lasts. After just 30 seconds, Rhino runs in and blasts Meanie with a gore. He has a bit more trouble with Chilly Willy, but hits him with a piledriver. Rhino's not done though, as he grabs Meanie's manager Jasmine St. Clair and hits a terrifying looking piledriver off the second rope, and gives one to referee H.C. Loke through a table off the apron. While it was good to see Rhino, it's slightly gutting that he had no match on this card. He would wrestle again in the venue many times over the following years though, for quite a few promotions, from Jersey All-Pro to many matches for TNA. His last match in the building as of me making this video was earlier in 2025, where he challenged for the NWA World Title, a belt he last held 20 years ago. Do you feel old when I say that? 'Cause I did. The rest of the undercard continues with a parade of ECW's more unusual gimmicks, starting with the two remaining Baldies. Of all the Baldies that ECW had, from Red Dog, also known as Rodney Mack, to Vito LaGrasso, to PN News, to perhaps most infamously Vic Grimes, the last two left in the group were Tony DeVito and Angel. They would face the new tag team champions who won at Massacre on 34th Street, Danny Doring and Roadkill. This match is the first of only two defenses they would ever make of the tag belts, also retaining them against Hot Commodity at Guilty as Charged a few weeks later. The two teams would essentially have the real opening match, with a very quick pace where the popular team won. The third match on the night featured an interesting looking Muppet show of a group, fronted by Elvis impersonator Bilvis Wesley, formerly known as Beautiful Bill Wiles. He would be accompanied by House of Hardcore trainee The Prodigy, as well as the Prodigette, who was trained by Dusty Rhodes, as well as Shawn Michaels Wrestling Academy graduate Chris Kruger. That's quite a collection of names all in one place there. Danny Doring on commentary notes that Wiles hated the Elvis gimmick that Paul Heyman gave him, but I noticed that he kept using it after ECW for at least a year after the company closed. Bilvis faced Balls Mahoney in what is essentially a handicap match, but one that was somehow in the favour of Balls and his trusty steel chair, as he handily outlasted the whole group to win the match. The Pro Wrestling Torch would add in the following week that Kruger had bladed severely and blood gushed from his head. He was later taken to the hospital. Dreamer and Doring dispute this though, saying he got cut for real, or hard way as it's known in wrestling. Tommy also says that Kruger used to drive all the way from Texas for his ECW bookings. A 25-hour drive to get bludgeoned by Balls and a visit to the hospital doesn't sound like the most fun of ways to spend a weekend. While I'm being quite flippant, it's not at all fair to compare many of these new names to the mainstay ECW talent who'd been there longer, and Bilvis and his crew, among others, were still finding their footing. It's very difficult not to though, when ECW in years past would have had many more established stars on their shows. Many of those stars had either moved on to bigger companies or fallen out with ECW, but fortunately they still had some names in the building. While watching the rest of this show, one thing is very clear. Even though things weren't looking good for the company, there was still a mindset of building up new talent for the future, or at least changing directions for some who had been around a while longer. After the third match, Joey Styles and Joel Gertner come out and the show really feels like it's getting started now. Joey has some fun with the crowd before they tape an intro to Hardcore TV, starting with Joey's trademark, "Hello everyone and welcome," and a dirty limerick from Gertner. The two are quickly interrupted by Cyrus, who comes out to introduce not just Jerry Lynn, but the new heel, simply the best version of Jerry Lynn. The turn to the dark side for Jerry came after his brief run as ECW World Champion ended, losing it after just a month and a few days at November to Remember to Steve Corino, another who was being built up into a top-level star of the company. On November 11th, 2000, days after the pay-per-view, we find Jerry Lynn sitting in front of a mirror, no doubt for dramatic effect. Cyrus enters the frame, to which Lynn first reacts with hostility. Cyrus manages to calm down the former champion and convinces him that he got screwed out of the world title, and Jerry begins to hear him out. The following week's episode begins with Cyrus listing the various ways that Jerry had been overlooked and underappreciated by ECW. He's looking into the camera, but he's not talking to us. He's talking only to Jerry. A bit like how I imagine he pictures joining the Don Callis family to people today. I talked about the company having plans for the future, and the next few matches definitely show that. First, Jerry Lynn would defeat Spike Dudley in what might well have been the most technical wrestling match of Spike's entire ECW career. Then C.W. Anderson would beat Super Crazy, who himself had been pushed earlier in the year, winning the TV title after RVD gave it up due to injury. Next on the card though, a newer addition to the roster would get a big win over a veteran, and like many things in ECW, it's not quite that simple. The match had originally been set to be Nova vs Easy Money, who Tommy Dreamer notes is someone that Paul Heyman was a big fan of. Easy had joined the company in June, and would quickly become a regular on shows. He would wrestle with Nova for a few minutes before blood started pouring from Nova's ear, and the referee would call for the bell. Danny Doring says on the RF video commentary that Nova was, quote, doing a burst eardrum gimmick. The Observer also notes that this was an angle, but explains that it stems from a real ear injury that Nova was dealing with. The angle was done because if Nova needs surgery on his ear, he'll be out 6 weeks. After the match ends, Tommy Dreamer, along with two more relatively new ECW talents, Christian York and Joey Matthews, come out to check on Nova. Easy, as well as his hot commodity teammates, Chris Hamrick and Julio De Niro, go after them, and a 6-man tag breaks out. Future Dreamer on commentary says that he in particular was, quote, a huge fan of York and Matthews, and said that he thought of them as the next top tag team act. Well, he was half right, as Joey Matthews would achieve quite a bit of success in WWE in a different team, with Johnny Nitro as MNM, while it would take York a fair bit longer to eventually get signed by TNA in 2012. The 6 men have an absolute brawl of a match, with even Tommy Dreamer attempting a dive and catching his feet on the top rope on the way over. The match would end with Easy Money getting a pinfall victory over Tommy Dreamer, but not without interference from C.W. Anderson, Tommy's next opponent at Guilty as Charged. Perhaps the most notable of all the matches that night was the main event, which was originally set to be Just Incredible challenging Steve Corino for the ECW World title. There's just one problem though. Ever since Massacre on 34th Street, the Sandman had possession of the title belt. After a very long entrance, which as usual got through the whole of his Metallica song, Sandman gets on the microphone and demands that the match be made a 3-way dance. He does make a very valid point. How are the other two gonna fight for the belt if he's the one wearing it? When I told you about Sandman stealing the belt at the last pay-per-view, I said it would be worth remembering for later. I was referring to a very nerdy detail that I actually first noticed when making my ECW Arena video last year. On June 8th, 1993, the very first episode of television from the ECW arena aired, and on that night, Don Morocco would defend the ECW heavyweight title against the Sandman. Fast forward to the final ever ECW match in the same building, and the Sandman is challenging for that same, albeit different looking title. This time though, he was wearing the belt to the ring despite not being the champion. I did say it was a nerdy thing to point out. The match itself is actually fairly short for a main event, with Just Incredible getting eliminated not very long in. Steve Corino takes a scary looking superplex onto a guardrail propped up by chairs. After this, Justin attempts to whip Corino into the ropes, where Francine, who he wasn't getting along with, was set to crack Corino with a cane. Steve reverses the whip though, and Francine hits her own client, leading to another caning from the Sandman and an old school expulsion from Corino to take Justin out of the match. On his way out of the arena, Francine can be heard shouting at Justin that he's the one who screwed up. Now I could make a joke there that all the not single people are gonna get, but I'm not going to. It's almost fitting in a way that this match and the night ended with a callback to a classic ECW moment. The Sandman, just like Terry Funk did at Hardcore Heaven 94, would request chairs be thrown into the ring by the fans, who would gladly oblige. Luckily for Steve Corino though, he was more fortunate than poor Rocco Rock, who took the brunt of it by laying in the ring while the chairs flew in back in 94. Steve had the good sense to get out of there until the chairs stopped coming. Afterwards, he and Sandman are left with a big stack of chairs in the ring, and spend the final few minutes staggering around and slipping on them. Sandman misses a rolling rock, diving off the top rope and crashing into the pile of chairs. When he gets up, Corino hits old school expulsion again, a sort of variant on the twist of fate. After a distraction from Jack Victory, Corino hits Sandman with a cowbell, which he carried as a reference to his brutal bull rope match with Dusty Rhodes earlier in the year. He then pins the Sandman to win the match. Despite still being the champion, Corino wouldn't get his belt back though, as Justin comes back in to attack Corino and the Sandman gets the upper hand in the end with his cane. All of this was planned to build towards guilty as charged, but for now, the show ends quite fittingly with the Sandman celebrating with the fans, world title belt in one hand and his cane in the other. Clearly from the optimistic booking plans, ECW weren't expecting this to be their final show there, but what an appropriate ending knowing that it was. After all the talk from some wrestlers about boycotting the show, it's not clear if anyone actually did, though some wrestlers weren't there for other reasons. The Observer notes that Simon Diamond, Johnny Swinger, Jim Mitchell and Dawn Marie weren't there as they were at Swinger's wedding, and New Jack wasn't because he'd had a falling out with Paul Heyman. It had been reported a week earlier that the dispute had come over New Jack working the Jersey All-Pro show at the ECW arena. He would effectively be gone from the company, with his last ECW match being against Angel on the non-pay-per-view portion of Massacre on 34th Street, which would later air on Hardcore TV. The other notable name that Dave mentions is Kid Cash, who had suffered broken ribs at the Elks Lodge show and was advised not to work. While the company technically sold out the seated tickets for Holiday Hell, they were disappointed by the turnout afterwards. As reported in Figure 4 Weekly, it was said to be a full house, but attendance was down since there weren't people standing around everywhere. The Observer would report that this was similar to Queen's, in that every seat was packed, but there was no overflow, with the crowd estimated at about 1,000. Critical reception seems to have been best summarised by Brian Alvarez, who said he had heard it called a decent show with nothing spectacular happening, save for a chair throwing incident in the main event. Backstage at the ECW arena, the wrestlers did in fact get their checks this time. However, there would be a catch. The wrestlers were given paychecks covering 2 weeks on December 23rd. The checks were post-dated to December 27th, meaning that the wrestlers weren't allowed to cash them before the Christmas holiday. Even with the latest checks, the company is still 6 weeks behind on paying the wrestlers. While the roster would again get paid at Guilty as Charged, this would still leave them several weeks behind on pay, as they would be until the company closed. Tommy Dreamer on the RF video commentary made sure to point out that these were very difficult times for many on the ECW roster. But the best they could do was continue to hope that the company would pull through the difficult times, like they'd done before. On January 6, 2001, the Torch would report something that really began to spell the end for the company. As a spokesperson for the MSG network says ECW's syndicated show is not scheduled to air on January 6th. ECW has paid a fee to air the show throughout its run. While at the time Heyman was telling people that it would all be resolved, this would mark the official end for hardcore TV, as the December 31st show would be the last to air anywhere. The timing of this was particularly awful, as it meant that their episode set to air the day before the next pay-per-view wouldn't air. While this might not have had much of an effect on Guilty as Charged itself, as Brian Alvarez put it, I think if ECW fans tuned into MSG on Saturday night and found a George Foreman grill infomercial, they'd still buy the pay-per-view the next afternoon. But the perception issue is what is really important. Not having a show in that slot would just reiterate to fans that the company is in such bad shape that they couldn't even afford to air their TV show the night before a pay-per-view in the market the pay-per-view is airing from. The future would continue to look bleak for ECW, but there was one last big show before the end came. On January 7th, the company would return to the Hammerstein Ballroom, selling it out one final time for Guilty as Charged. 2,500 fans would see the Sandman win the ECW World title for real this time. Officially this time. Only for it to be ripped away from him by a challenger he'd had a heated feud with for all of 2000, when Rhino defeated him for that title. Also on the show, Tommy Dreamer would have what he called in 2013 one of his all-time favourite matches, defeating C.W. Anderson in an I Quit match. On the RF video commentary for Holiday Hell, Dreamer says that Anderson was, quote, the next guy in line to get a push. And sadly, this push would never come for the then 30-year-old Anderson. I've been trying to find a way to end this video not on a completely depressing note, and here's the best I could come up with. For the average ECW fan, the one that was watching on television, buying the pay-per-views and going to the live shows, they were getting the best ECW that the roster was able to give them. And the company would go out with a bang at Guilty as Charged. For one final night, arguably until One Night Stand, ECW felt like a hot promotion with dedicated fans and a roster who was ready to show the world who they are. This was helped immensely by Rob Van Dam and Jerry Lynn closing the show, not with a classic like they'd had before, but with a match that left the fans happy. On screen, ECW was still presenting the product they always had, with the stars they had left, and a new crop of wrestlers that Paul Heyman had hoped would take them into 2001, many of whom would go on to have long careers. Despite my covering of some quite bleak times in this video, RVD's reception as he walked into the Hammerstein is the positive side of how we can remember the end of ECW, with a roaring crowd, preferably shouting obscenities at Cyrus. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.